Hi everyone. Still waiting for the little spinny thing that lets me know I'm totally online. Almost okay, there we are. All right, how are you all? It is May 28th, hard to believe, Thursday. And we are here for the final chapters of The Body Keeps the Score. I have to apologize because my husband went to go pick up groceries, which means I've got to sort of listen through the doors to the kids, so we may have visitors. But that's okay. So, all right, so we can go through these three chapters. And then please, comment as you wish in the comment section about your thoughts, and then kind of sum things up for the book. Hi, Elizabeth. And so that's what we'll do. All right, so chapter 18, filling in the holes, creating structures. I really, really, hey Diane, liked this chapter a lot, and I'm going to confess that I did a lot of this last couple weeks have been crazy, so I did a little bit more listening than reading this time. I actually bought the audio book, and I enjoyed listening to this chapter. I read a little bit more of the others, but this chapter, listening to it really painted this picture of this kind of therapy that it's describing. So basically, um, this chapter talks about psychomotor therapy. So this kind of therapy, it's basically group work where someone takes their trauma. Not right now. I need you to go in the other room for a minute. Wow, that's scary. You should not be on that website. Turn it off. Turn your computer off and just play. Um, she has a computer for school, and we've turned off a lot of things, yet she is smart enough to find her way around them. Anyway, so it's this kind of group therapy where someone who has trauma to process, and they have it frequently talks about like parenting situations. So someone who has had a traumatic childhood and they really are upset with their parents, but for differing reasons they haven't or have, and it hasn't had a good outcome or whatever, talked through that with their parents but would like to. So what the scenes that were painted were of these different patients, who would sit in a chair and they would repaint a picture. So they would pick someone in the group therapy room to act or stand in as the character of their father, perhaps. And then would speak to the father a little bit or talk a little bit about what the father had done, and then would invite someone to stand in the position as mother. Um, so this is someone who would sit in as that. And they could also invite like a contact person, so like a comfort person, to be near them. So it was really interesting because so he's talking about, for example, this woman Maria. So she picks someone to enroll as her father to stand there, someone to enroll as her mother to stand there, and she tells them what she wishes they had done during her childhood. She tells them what they did to her, what she wishes they had done, and kind of leans into those feelings, and in that way is able to release a lot of things. And then the interesting thing was there, with someone who was witnessing this, right, who would say back to them what they felt to kind of help them visualize, to help Maria visualize what she had said and what she was feeling. So that person served as a witness. Usually, like the lead therapist would serve as the witness, and then she was able to invite in. Someone else. So he did this with Maria, then he did this with Ellen. He did this a few different times. And in this one scene, she had invited in her mother, she had invited in her father, then she invited in someone to stand in as like the ideal mother or ideal father, or at least the one who behaved as she had wished, as the client had wished. And so she tells her father, "You abused me. It was awful," and also allowed herself to see what her father had gone through that may had caused him to do those things. Then she enrolls her mother. She envisions what her mother had gone through, that her mother was frightened, that her mother was scared, her mother didn't know how to speak to her father, and then tells her mother, "I wish you had stood up for us. I wish you had told him to F off and that we were going to leave if he didn't improve." Then she brings in the ideal father and says, "This is how my ideal father would have treated me and what I need from him, and this is my ideal mother." And in that way, the patient is able to rescript everything. So nothing has actually changed. The trauma happened, that has not been erased. The parents may still be jerks who are not, being what the client needs, and yet they're able to rewrite that script in a way that kind of remaps things out, which, if you remember, the book sets out to ask the question, can you rewrite the maps of your brain? If you've been traumatized, can you rewrite the map in such a way that you can live and feel in healthy ways? And this chapter argues that this might be a way to do that. I really, really loved this chapter a lot, and all the different kinds of therapies mentioned. I was really intrigued by this one because for me, this one seemed really doable. But moving on to the other chapters and looking at the behind chapters, I think it's interesting that, each of these different kind of therapies could really be well suited to different kinds of people. So while yoga might be the best treatment for someone, it might not be for me. While this might be the best treatment for my particular personality and trauma, for other people, no way. So it's pretty cool. And so then we move on to the more neurological treatment, so neurotherapy, and so there again, maybe neurotherapy is better for some people than this last chapter. So neurotherapy was a really interesting kind of therapy where they look at the different brain waves, and you hook up like an EEG to your patient. So the patient would have an EEG biofeedback kind of thing hooked up to their brain so that you can monitor the brain waves. And essentially what happens is that person would be trained through a lot of practice with this to kind of retrain the brain waves to behave the way they should. Because basically what has been found is, traumatized people, because of the way their brain waves look, they have a hard time making their brain waves don't come together in a coherent pattern, it says on page 313. And it makes it basically really hard for them to pay attention to things. So they can't filter out irrelevant information. And traumatized people often don't learn from experiences. They often don't engage fully in their daily lives. They often seem distracted. Their brain is not organized to pay very careful attention to what's going on in the present moment. And so this kind of therapy attempts to help the brain sort out those waves so that they can then pay better attention. This is normally what your brain waves would look like. So that's milliseconds after the brain is presented with input, it organizes the meaning of the incoming information. All the regions of the brain normally collaborate in this kind of synchronized pattern. But in people with PTSD, there's a lot less coordination of those brain waves. So the brain waves have trouble filtering out information and problems attending to stimulus. So, I'm not a scientist who can read those, but even looking at those, to me, and hearing that description, they look quite different. So the goal of this therapy is to help train brain waves to look more like this. So that was pretty interesting to me. Oh, my husband's here, so I'm gonna shut that door in a second. So another thing that was interesting in working with a traumatized patient after doing a series, lots of this kind of therapy, shows how they were able to help a 10-year-old who had been traumatized begin to reorganize thoughts in such a way that that 10-year-old could focus better. So this was one of the first sessions, how they drew a family. This one was, this one was the initial one. This one was after 20 sessions of this working with the brainwaves to retrain them. So see, it already has more detail, which is indicative that that child could pay more attention. And then this was after 40 sessions. So it's pretty impressive. He mentions in this book, and as I was kind of perusing online as well, that neurofeedback is something that people are beginning to think, or there could be evidence for being helpful for people with ADD or ADHD to help them to reorganize their thoughts, because that is an attention, that's all about attention, right? So anyway, it was pretty cool. So it stabilizes your brain and increases resiliency. And even one thing I thought was really interesting, and kind of a consistent thing throughout this book is, hey, I'm gonna close the door. It's funny when my kids walk in the room, as long as I'm not saying anything inappropriate, I can keep going, but my husband walks by and I'm like, oh, hi. Stage fright. Just kidding. Anyway, he talks about this beginning in neurofeedback beginning kind of in the late 60s, early 70s, and even as early as the late 50s, 1950s, really. But in 1971, he talks about this 23-year-old who had epilepsy, like pretty severe epilepsy. She'd have grand mal seizures 2 or more times a month, which I think that's pretty significant. My brother had epilepsy. Those are really scary. But she trained in neurofeedback, and at the end of 3 months, she no longer had seizures, which is pretty interesting. But he said just about as soon as that study was published, not much later, 1978, it kind of fell off the map again, because it was around the 70s that people really started to discover psychiatric drugs. So we kind of see that throughout the book, that, you know, there's these bursts of studies and interest in things, and then something will happen, often in the introduction of a new drug or a new kind of treatment, where the focus on that study kind of pulls back. And so he says, you know, there's been fits and starts of interest in this. One of the questions that's come up a lot in these discussions is what treatments are covered by insurance and which ones aren't. And he does say that this treatment doesn't have widespread acceptance, and one of the reasons, other than like competing, you know, competition out there, is that that there's not many kinds of this that are actually covered by insurance. So there's your answer to that. So it's expensive for the consumers, which means it's hard for practitioners to do it, which means the large scale studies can't happen. So even as I was like Googling this type of therapy, I had a hard time finding a lot of research on it on websites that I know and trust. That doesn't mean that the websites out there aren't providing accurate information. I just thought that was interesting, and that might be the reason. All right, so I'm gonna zip through the rest of this. Lots of cool stuff about brainwaves, lots of cool stuff about your, you know, what your brain looks like at different states. I thought this one was pretty interesting. So I wish I could show this better, but all these different waves here show different things. So your sleep looks like this. That's your brainwaves. Your drowsy looks like this. Your relaxed focus, I would love some of that. Looks like this. Your relaxed thought looks like this. Your active thinking looks like this. And then your excited is just this is like constant, almost lks like a big black line, because your brainwaves are so busy. So all of of that stuff is pretty interesting in looking at your brain waves. But trauma, he says, can change your brain waves. So the point of neurofeedback is to help you train in that. One of these websites I looked at was talking about how they do that and the normal amount of sessions it might take. And just like that picture of the 10-year-old's drawings, it says usually people would do this for about 40 sessions or something like that. So pretty interesting. All right, the last chapter, another one that really like piqued my interest, was talking about theater. I know that we have some like super theatrical people in this group, and I'd love to hear some of your insights into this chapter and reflections on the chapter, or even if you have any experience with this. So he talks about theater and rhythm, so theater and music, and how that really can help people who have been through trauma. I have never thought about how this goes all the way back to our first experience of theater, which is, when we think of theater beginning, we think about like the Trojan War, we think about Sophocles, we think about Greek drama. And he points out that when Greek drama was formed, I mean, the world was at war, and the Greeks were at war, and he points out that probably any Greek male would have been drafted into some kind of war at some point. Therefore, all of the actors in Greek drama and Greek tragedies would have some understanding of what they're acting out because they had seen war and they had seen death. And I thought that was really interesting. And he said, that on page 334, anyone who's come into contact with extreme pain, suffering, or death has no trouble understanding Greek drama. It's all about bearing witness to the stories of veterans. That was crazy. I've never thought about that. And then he begins to talk about drama a little bit more later, but he starts to talk about rhythm and music and how that gives us meaning, both as individuals, but corporately. And he talks about prayer and ritual, the Wailing Wall, Mass, all kinds of different prayers that involve rhythm and music, whether it's rhythmic prayer or actual music, and how that gives meaning and gives us a way to express things. And then he talks about Desmond Tutu and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. I think anybody who's heard me talk about books has probably at some point heard me like ooh and ah over how much I love Archbishop Desmond Tutu and how much I love the Book of Joy that he wrote with the Dalai Lama. And he talks a lot about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in that book. But one thing I had not realized was it says that during this time, so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a time during, like after apartheid, when they had these trials. Basically what happened is people who had been victimized by apartheid told their truth. They told their stories, and the people who had victimized them had to listen. And that was part of the reconciliation process. But what he says here is that these events were framed by collective singing and dancing. Witnesses recounted the unspeakable atrocities that had been inflicted on them, and when they became overwhelmed, Tutu would interrupt their testimony and lead the entire audience in prayer, song, and dance until the witnesses could contain their sobbing and halt their physical collapse. This enabled participants to pendulate in and out of reliving their horror and eventually find words to describe what had happened to them. I fully credit Tutu and other members of this commission with averting what might have been an orgy of revenge, as is so common when victims are finally set free. I was just in awe of that. Gives me another reason to just love Archbishop Desmond Tutu. But he begins to then talk about how theater and drama, yeah, Rhonda says a rosary. Yeah, that that rhythmic, that's both rhythmic in what you're doing with your fingers, but also with your mouth. And you know, I'm Episcopalian. Very much of what we do is rhythmic with both our bodies and our mouths and our prayers and our songs. And I think that's true of a whole lot of religious traditions when you gather corporately for worship. Side note, you know, here in this pandemic, where religious leaders are really trying to teach people how to do that in their home, whether they're doing it by themselves or with whoever they live with, how to put that rhythm, that rhythmic prayer, those rhythmic songs into your life. And Rhonda's exactly right. If you come from a tradition that would use a rosary, that would be a phenomenal way to do that. All right, so treating trauma through theater. He talks about 3 different places that do this. He talks about the Urban Improv in Boston and trauma drama program that it inspired in Boston public schools and residential centers. He talks about the Possibility Project in New York City, and then Shakespeare and Company in Lenox, Massachusetts. Basically, through these 3 programs, what he's identified in his research is that we have been taught as a people to cut ourselves off from our emotions, or to cut ourselves off. Hey, Lori. Oh, it's so good to see you. I miss you. So we've been trained to cut ourselves off from what we're feeling, but trauma does the opposite of that. It teaches those who are acting, and I would say those observing, to embrace those feelings. So he says, training actors involves training people to go against the tendency not only to feel deeply, but to convey feeling at every moment to the audience, so the audience will get it and not close off to it. And that is what the founder of Shakespeare and Company says. All right, so try to go a little bit faster. So I so loved this because it talks a lot about adolescents, like traumatized adolescents, and how theater can help them, 1, to identify feelings, 2, to identify language, 3, to be expressive and own it. And it was quite beautiful. So, and it makes all of these things safe. There are parameters for it. So he talks about the trauma drama in Boston schools, and where this really got me was I was thinking about a beloved school that has been really a big part of my heart, and Hillary Raining, who started the Hive. Hi, Hillary. She's very invested in this school as well, and a lot of people here know of this school. It's called the St. James School in Philadelphia, and I just adore what they're doing. Like, they're doing it right, but they help middle school kids who don't live in don't have access to good schools, and would probably not graduate from high school, and certainly wouldn't go to college. And they help those kids. They pull their educational levels up. They really invest in the students. They really invest in their families. They become a family to those kids. And they see them, so that it's a 4th to 8th grade program, but they see them all the way through. They follow them all the way to college, and it's amazing. There are some people on the Hive here who are teachers there. Kudos to you. You are my heroes. But anyway, when I got to work with their 5th graders and my 5th graders when I was a school chaplain, one of the things I heard the students talk about a lot was how theater was a big part of their program. And I couldn't help think of this as I was reading, how important theater is to helping us act out our feelings and express ourselves in ways that we may not otherwise feel free to. So he talks about how the trauma drama helps kids to experiment with new roles and feelings in ways that otherwise weren't free to. And this was part of the public school system for a bit until it kind of hit the bureaucracy, and just like music and PE and theater and art and all that starting to be pulled out of schools, this was too. So it's really unfortunate. But it's just beautiful listening to that. And then he goes on to talk about the Possibility Project in New York. And so in the trauma drama, the kids learn to act and to own feelings, and to listen to one another in these beautiful, amazing ways. But in the Possibility Project, they would actually write their own scripts. So it's also, these are foster care youth. Um, and the founder talks a lot about how traumatic foster care is. So in the first scenario, Boston schools, those are kids who are at risk. In Possibility Project, these are kids who are in the foster care system, and they don't. He talks about how they've really had to learn to be survivors. They've really had to learn to take care of themselves. And because they're jumping from place to place to place to place, they know how to talk and work a system. But because they're jumping from place to place to place to place, they don't have good relationships. And so the first part of the program is to build team building and to build trust within a group, which is a big deal. The second one is when they start to share their life stories, and they do that through drama. And then from there, they get to write their own story. And I just thought it was really powerful. I feel like I can't adequately describe it. If you haven't read it or listened to it, you should definitely read this chapter. It was really beautiful. But one of the things he said that made me think about the St. James School, again, on page 344, it says, if you want to give them, kids, a sense of control, you have to give them power over their destiny rather than intervene on their behalf. You cannot help, fix, or save the young people you're working with. What you can do is work side by side with them, help them to understand their vision and realize it with them. By doing that, you give them back control. We're healing trauma without anyone ever mentioning the word. And that was just beautiful. The final one was Shakespeare in the Courts, which I thought was super cool because he talks again about teenagers. So this is something that they're sentenced to do. It's like a court sentence. Instead of going to jail or something else, or community service or whatever, this is what they have to do. So these are kids who've been found guilty of fighting, drinking, stealing, property crimes, and things like that. So they've got 6 weeks, 4 afternoons a week of intensive Shakespearean acting study. And he talks about how not only does that help the teenagers discover the richness of language, and not just the richness of language they're already using, but the richness of this visceral, deep Shakespearean stuff, that then they begin to feel it in themselves. So they have to learn, they don't learn the lines, they learn the feelings. So the program teaches them to react to the words and react to the feelings that it stirs up within them, and to memorize their script that way, as opposed to just memorizing lines, and how that really comes to mean something to them, and how a lot of trauma is acted out in our bodies, and a lot of Shakespearean stuff has like sword fighting and stuff in it. And so they get to do those things, but they have to negotiate with one another and communicate with one another so that they don't hurt one another. And it's like a really beautiful, beautiful thing. And at the end, they perform in front of the community. So it becomes this big communal thing where they're risking showing emotion, and the community is watching this. And so it's this beautiful, to me, almost like healing thing. But I thought a good summary of the whole chapter was on page 346, when he says, learning to experience and tolerate deep emotion is essential for recovery from trauma. Probably a good summary of the whole book, but especially right here in talking about theater. And I just thought that was a beautiful way to end this book. So, all right, and then there's an epilogue if you'd like to read that. But I'm curious what you think. 3 very different chapters. We had a kind of group therapy where you're remapping your trauma and remapping your memories, not changing them, just remapping them. by doing some group work and kind of rewriting your story and talking to people in your past, even though they're not there. Then we had the next chapter, which was about neurofeedback or neurotherapy, a very different way of doing things. And then we had theater, which is a very group bodily thing as well. So curious what some of you thought of that, and just generally what you thought of the book. I will say for myself that this was a hard book for me to read. I'm glad I did it. But it was hard, and one of the outcomes for me in this, I'll just be really personal with you and share a few outcomes as one. I know that I need to get back into therapy, especially living through this pandemic, because it's between the pandemic and reading this book, it's definitely stirred up some things for me that I was kind of pushing down, or at least I was at least able to ignore. So that's one thing. The other thing is, it's really made me want to be a better parent. I know that not everyone reading this book is a parent or has kids at home, and so your perspective on this is, I would love to hear what your perspective is on this. Mine, I just kept thinking, oh God, I hope I don't screw them up. Because so much of child therapy or child trauma happens in early childhood at home, and parents and caregivers and grandparents or whoever caretakers are, kudos to you. Your role is really important, and so I've been even thinking about how can I manage things within my life and workload a little bit better so that I can give my kids the nourishment that they need and the nurturing that they need, because they need me. They need a caretaker who is present. And so that's one really positive outcome of this book for me, is that. So I'm curious what you thought overall. I know some of you are still trying to finish reading. Some of you may get to this video a long time later, and that's great. If you come to this video a month from now, please comment and tell us what you think. Diane says, I think there'll be a lot of people in therapy after all this is over. Maybe we can all join a theater group. That's a fantastic job. Maybe we should all go join a theater group. Maybe we should start a theater group. Any other thoughts? Well, this will stay up. You can keep adding things, keep adding quotes, keep adding thoughts about these 3 chapters or the book overall. And I would just hope and ask for you that there is, one practical good takeaway for you. It may have stirred up some muck that was hard. But is there something positive that you can take away from this, whether it's taking up theater or going back into therapy to get some tools, or taking up yoga or something like that, spending some time talking to others and not pushing it down. I think one thing that the book teaches us is that we're all different. There are therapies like talk therapy that work really well for some people, and for other people who've been traumatized, that's absolutely the worst thing. So I hope that you have a positive outcome from this, because I certainly did, and I enjoyed reading it with you. So, The Body Keeps the Score. Definitely a hard book to read, but I recommend it. So, all right, everyone, keep commenting on this. Keep interacting on the Hive, and I'd encourage you to go back and look at some of the posts from yesterday, because there were some really good, important posts about engaging in our world in important ways, especially for you white women out there who look like me, who can turn a blind eye sometimes to some of the crap going on in the world, especially the crap that's being done to our brothers and sisters of color. And so I would encourage you to look at that comment thread, go out there and find some resources to read. Pick up, we don't have a new book decided for the next little bit, so pick up a book about race. Learn something about race and learn how to be an ally. So, yep. And you don't have to be super nice about it, because sometimes the nice white lady can cause more problems than going and saying something. So, All right, enough of Michelle's ramblings for today. This was a pleasure, everyone. I hope that you have a fantastic Thursday and keep on commenting.